So here's the thing about Dr. Champ from Bojack Horseman. There's a lot of negativity hurled onto him from some parts of the community, and I often feel like a lot of people who blame him for Bojack's downfall and despise him for what he became by the end of the series are missing the central purpose of this character in the first place. I mean, I can't blame people for viewing Dr. Champ negatively, as he leaves a rather poor taste in the mouth of us viewers as the series comes to a close, but I think there is a really strong culture of blame and hate behind him that isn't particularly deserved, especially since he is also a victim of addiction. I'd also like to say, first of all, we all need to do better and stop looking for someone to blame in all these shows filled with flawed characters that make terrible mistakes. This isn't the only show where people do that either. We naturally look for someone to point fingers at when anything goes wrong. However, the mistakes these characters make are their own responsibility. It's important for their own growth to be able to admit that, and blaming other people and forcing responsibility elsewhere doesn't help further that cause, especially in Bojack's case, where Dr. Champ is simply revealing true things that Bojack has done in the past. Not a kind or forgiving move on his part, but looking to blame him for Bojack's retribution and him facing his own consequences is, I feel, misguided. Responsibility Without Blame for Addiction, an article that I've linked in the description below, really helped me understand the duality of addiction treatment and how to understand and deal with addicts. Where yes, it is important to hold those accountable for their actions and to recognize the damage they have done, but to do so in a way that is with concern for their well-being and compassion for their experience, and not accuse them or blame them of their choices. Blame comes from hostile emotions or feelings and can often lead to the addict regressing into their old tendencies. It's difficult for many to comprehend, which is completely valid as the ideas seem contradictory, but it's important to realize that blame is different than holding someone responsible, and that it doesn't have to be 100% in either direction either. Addiction can affect people's choices, that's true. Addicts do continue to have free will, that is also true. They do have to decide to get help, but there are degrees to this. Blaming someone doesn't help any of the parties involved. In my opinion, they're doing the exact same thing that makes them despise Dr. Champ in the first place, blaming other people for one's problems, in this case, Bojack's. See, Dr. Champ begins the series in a very positive place. He has a husband, a fulfilling job that he seems to be talented at, and a happy disposition with lots of clarity on his addiction that he has seemingly put behind him. And we also know that he's overcome great odds due to his mention of his daughter in one of his final appearances. We're not particularly told what happened to her, or that she's alive or not, but I certainly took it to mean that she had maybe passed or at least been injured due to a consequence resulting from Dr. Champ's actions. He also states in the episode A Little Uneven is all that after he left rehab, he knew a single drop of alcohol would send him back down that same path. He is in a positive place, but admits that it is a precarious one. And then, by outrageous happenstance, Bojack's water bottle full of vodka ends up in his hand, sending him on a downward spiral that we don't see him escape from by the time the show ends. Can't really seek to blame Bojack for this either, though Dr. Champ certainly does. Yes, he shouldn't have had it in the first place, but this water bottle flips perfectly into a carton from like 2 stories up. That is some wild coincidence. Plus, it's when Bojack decides to get rid of it. Like, come on. And as a result, later on, Dr. Champ reveals everything that Bojack told him in what he thought was confidential therapy to Biscuits Braxby and Paige Sinclair to bring about Bojack's ultimate cancellation, until he'll probably be able to make a comeback, inevitably. Hollywood has a terrible memory. Always important to keep that in mind. And clearly, even after Bojack has fully brought him to rehab, he has relapsed back into his habits, blaming him for everything that he's become and the choices that he is actively making, including the ones to attempt to destroy Bojack's career. It sounds real familiar to a struggle a certain other horse had to go through the first 3 seasons of this show, until Todd finally shouted it into his face that he was the cause of it. And he still has to struggle to repel this tendency as the series goes on. In sunk cost in all that, near the end of the show, he regresses into the old Bojack from Todd's perspective.
Who are these reporters anyway? They're so perfect. I'll bet there's dirt on them that we could dig up.
I don't think that's it.
Yeah, that'll teach those bloodthirsty leeches what happens when they try to tear someone down over their past without even considering the possibility that he's changed.
Have you changed?
Yes, obviously.
Because this feels like old Bojack.
He blames everything that's coming out on these reporters and wants to take revenge on them, instead of accepting the consequences for things that he did indeed do and moving to make amends. Bojack blamed his terrible actions on drugs, alcohol, his parents, his upbringing, Hollywood, everything he could without taking responsibility for himself. He was fully aware of his addictions, his alcoholism, his tendency towards narcissism, but indulged in them all the same to avoid dealing with his own internal struggles. As the closer says in Stop the Presses,
when you do bad things, you have something you can point to when people eventually leave you. It's not you tell yourself, it's that bad thing you did. Do you often keep people at arm's length? Are you afraid of being known and knowing others?
he uses these things as scapegoats so that he doesn't get hurt himself. He can blame people leaving on terrible things he's done or being drunk, rather than admitting that he is the person who drove them away. It was his choice. It's a way for him to protect his sense of self after his self-esteem was ground down for such an extended period of time by his parents. He kept everyone around at arm's length so that no one would be able to perceive who he actually is, lest they turn on him and leave, as he automatically assumes they will because he views himself as an automatically terrible person, which is also not true. And now Dr. Champ is doing the same thing, pushing Bojack, who actually does care about him, away and looking for a scapegoat, not admitting that Bojack didn't particularly do this to him. Dr. Champ is the one who chose to keep coming back to the bar. He chose to keep ordering drinks. He chose not to go home to his husband or confide in him. Blaming Bojack is just another way to avoid the actual problem and rationalize the addiction as he sinks even further. It's honestly so terribly tragic to watch, but this is an absolutely classic move for addicts to pull, and honestly for any human. It's incredibly natural to want to transfer responsibility or absolve yourself of free will to avoid facing your poor decision. Why do you think managers delegate all their work onto their subordinates? In an addict's case, fear of losing the coping mechanism that they've become accustomed to causes them to find ways to excuse their behavior. Or perhaps in Bojack's case, not having that to point to won't give him an excuse for being an asshole, as he states is a fear of his before he goes into rehab. But in Dr. Champ's case, Bojack did this to him, ruined him, caused him to become this person. Using that allows him to continue making the easier choice of continuing his addiction and sinking further into it, rather than facing it as he has done in the past. We don't have many details on his last stint in rehab, but this time he does have someone to latch onto and project all of his internal struggles back on. This protects him from the fact that his husband left because of him and that he is responsible for his own relationship going under. Presumably, we don't actually know if that's what happened. He doesn't have to face those seemingly insurmountable mistakes and make any changes. He can just shift it all onto Bojack. It's fascinating to me to think about how Dr. Champ comes to this conclusion, but it actually lines up with one of the core tenets of rehab, or at least his rehab, which is that they are powerless over their addiction. In his mind, there's nothing he can do to change his behavior because Bojack gave him vodka, and once he takes a sip, it's over. But because he places all this blame onto Bojack, he's able to keep drinking because it isn't him or the alcohol that's ruining his life, it's Bojack. And this may seem like an absurd line of thought full of contradictions, but thought processes during the throes of addiction can be inherently skewed. I've even read that a lot of behavior for addicts can be similar to those with schizophrenia, delusions, hallucinations, inappropriate behavior, and sudden mood swings. There are distinct differences, of course, but some similarities that I think are worth addressing in terms of how an addict's brain works and why Dr. Champ acted so fundamentally different after he relapsed. The point is that this thought process is contradictory, especially given Dr. Champ has extensive knowledge about recovery processes, but he himself is unable to realize that and go back to the process that he believed in. He's a victim of this thinking, and he doesn't really seem to have an efficient support system to be able to pull him out of it and show him blatantly the error of his ways, which is an important part of post-rehab recovery and returning to a normal life as Dr. Champ wishes to live. But this draws a really stark parallel between Dr. Champ and Bojack, showing how easily these positive people who have overcome so much can still fall into the same tendencies they just escaped, and how addiction can severely alter people's personalities. Dr. Champ went from one of the most positive characters characters in the show to one that a majority of the audience dislikes due to his addiction. But it's important to remember his story isn't over. Yes, he leaves a bad taste in our mouths because of what he says to Bojack during their final goodbye, but this is an extremely low point for him. Dr. Champ is now approaching the state Bojack was in when the series began. He isn't doomed to stay in this position, just as Bojack wasn't when we first started. Just as Bojack is unsure he will stay sober for the rest of his life at the end of the series. It's never a finished process. He's becoming increasingly vindictive, messy, and unkempt, and is gradually losing the Dr. Champ that we became so familiar with. And he's perhaps beginning a really long process. But look at how far Bojack made it by the end of the series, and no offense at all, he's not a particularly young man. It's never too late to begin this process of recovery, to start improving yourself even after you have already done it. Dr. Champ likely has many years ahead of him where he will be able to recognize and start this process again. We're not sure what happened in his personal life. It's presumed that his husband likely left him after finding out, and I would guess that it's probable that that's why he wasn't successfully able to move through rehab and back into sober life once again. In other words, Dr. Champ has reached new lows, and that's likely why he's struggling more than ever, even after accomplishing this journey before and learning so much about how to make peace with life sober. Lows that Bojack, though, himself has reached, and we spent a lot of time knowing that Bojack blamed himself for all of these terrible things, believing that it was simply something he always did to those close to him, when in fact, it was a toxic behavior that he needed to improve on, but that he could improve on. That cycle was extremely difficult to break out of, even when you think you've gotten a handle on things, as I'll address later in this video. Dr. Champ has relapsed. Yes, that is not unheard of at all in addicts who come out of rehab successfully. More than 40% of addicts relapse after rehab, but the crucial thing to remember is that the journey isn't over. Rehab hasn't failed because you're still here and able to make things better for yourself and possibly make amends to those you've harmed. It doesn't mean you failed forever and that you can never try again. For Dr. Champ, this includes his family. He made a promise to his husband that he would never relapse again and failed, but I bet his husband would respect him a lot more if he admitted this failure and committed to rehab again when Bojack sent him there. And he still has time to be able to do this in the future. If his husband was able to forgive him once and accept his addiction, he can at least understand the relapse if you own up to it and show to him that you are serious about recovery. And sure, there's a good chance that Dr. Champ's husband would not be able to emotionally handle his addictions or the fear that Dr. Champ would one day relapse, and he would be valid if he didn't feel he could continue a relationship with him afterwards. But Dr. Champ is definitely capable of being forgiven. Another aspect regarding Dr. Champ that I see discussed a lot is his relation to Herb Kazaz. These two characters are compared to each other often as both being two examples of men that have been hurt simply by being Bojack's friend or confidant, given how much focus there is on his pattern with women specifically. Bojack even says himself that he's hurt a lot of men as well. I love that that's his defense, by the way, like, oh right, that makes it better. However, there is a clear difference between his apology to Herb and Bojack trying to make up to or help Dr. Champ. Bojack truly tried to right things from his mistake, even though it was entirely accidental. Yes, obviously he should not have been keeping alcohol around at all, but the consequences are so absurd. It's hard to shift blame entirely onto him for everything that ensues because of the one stray water bottle. Because immediately, Bojack tries to get the doctor back on— nope, not the doctor. Doctor is his name. Bojack tries to get Doctor back on track and supports him, with him at the bar, not partaking in alcohol himself, endorsing it, but trying to persuade him to return to sober life. He checks him into a rehab facility, knowing that it could be the start of his process to get better because, in his experience, that was the start of his. And all he needed to kickstart that was a friend, Diane, to push him to make that change, break out of that cycle. And you know he genuinely cares about Dr. Champ because he shows it to him with his actions. He stays with him all night and watches over him. He takes him to rehab. Bojack does apologize numerous times for his mistake with the water bottle, but this time he backs it up with actual deeds. Whereas with Herb, he makes no clear attempt to rectify his mistakes or show that he's actually apologetic. He does apologize and I think genuinely does feel guilty, but he's mostly apologizing to absolve himself of that guilt after living with it for so long. If he truly cared about Herb, he would have gone to visit him earlier and presumably would have at least thought of him in the 20 years after Horsing Around ended. Despite these differences, their stories do end in similar ways. Herb was never quite as vindictive as Dr. Champ was to Bojack, but they both ensure their final goodbye is one that makes him realize what he's done, to varying effectiveness. Herb needed a friend after his firing from Horsing Around. In fact, in the telescope, Herb outwardly states that he didn't even really care about Bojack's professional betrayal. Yes, he definitely missed his job and was upset at what the show became after he left, we see that, but he didn't despise Bojack for making that cold-hearted decision.
I don't care about the job! I did fine. I had a good life. But what I needed then was a friend. And you abandoned me. And I will never forgive you for that.
What he did despise him for was never attempting to apologize or make it up to him in the long 20 years after the show ended. Bojack had so much time on his hands, but wasted it doing nothing, not even really thinking about Herb until Sarah Lynn mentions that he has cancer for the first time. Out of sight, out of mind, as Bojack drinks to forget every awful thing he's done in an effort to keep moving forward. But realistically, he's moving in a circle. But Herb's criticism sticks with him for the rest of the show because it is completely true, and Bojack knows it. Bojack did abandon Herb, and he deserves to be held accountable for his actions there. While when Dr. Champ outwardly blames Bojack for taking him to rehab, as Bojack has ruined everything he's worked for, now that he's destroyed the perception of Dr. Champ as a recovered addict who never has anything to work on, which again is a flawed perception of yourself to have in the first place, not really realizing that Dr. Champ himself is sinking into alcoholism to the point where he would not be able to competently do his job and would actively be lying to these people he claims to care about on a daily basis. How are you supposed to promote recovery if you are not recovered yourself? Not only to these recovering addicts who are counting on him, but to his family as well. And this does not stick with Bojack because he recognizes his own patterns coming right out of Dr. Champ's mouth. He says to Diane later that it took someone else saying he ruins people for him to realize how utterly stupid it sounds and how irrational of a thought that is. It just isn't irrational when it's in your own brain to you. Addiction changes how you think. He knows Dr. Champ is just lashing out and that he did everything he could to get him back on track. He doesn't blame him, but he does recognize the lack of perspective that Dr. Champ currently has due to him being clouded by his addiction. And Bojack knows that he did the right thing here. He tried his best to rectify his mistake. One part of Dr. Champ that is super important as a character too, and why I love that he is in the series, is the concept of knowing what is right, but still rationalizing your own behavior and perpetuating the same cycles. Dr. Champ has so many techniques for overcoming addiction, but still succumbs to the pull and struggles to find his way out of it, even after being placed directly in a rehab center. This underlines the message that Season 6 had been trying to convey since the very first episode of the season, and even the finale of Season 5. Rehab is not a cure-all. It can help, give you great techniques to help you gain some control over your addiction, and help stabilize your mind when you feel things getting out of control. It can absolutely provide meaningful therapy, or in Dr. Champ's case, unofficial therapy, that helps you cope and deal with your emotions rationally. Does this mean that it's a perfect place or system? No. Bojack's not wrong in that it's a business that profits off of addiction, and it is ridiculously expensive. But as we see with Bojack himself, it can genuinely help. Does it always work? Evidently no. We see that many people continue to come back, and even Dr. Champ says directly that he doesn't believe many of the people leaving will be able to stay sober, which is quite the mindset for an addiction counselor to have, I will say. But as I've said so many times on this channel, growth is never, ever a linear process, nor do you ever reach a plateau where you're magically okay and never have to work on yourself again. We should always be listening to others, examining our own actions in other lenses, and trying to continue to grow and develop as an individual. And I think Dr. Champ perceiving himself as finished with his addiction and above everyone else in the rehab clinic is part of the reason for why his relapse was so abrupt and fast moving. But again, at the end of the day, Dr. Champ is a victim of addiction, just as Bojack is. This does not absolve him of the harsh words he says to Bojack, but it does explain his behavior and gives us the same context that we were given to Bojack throughout the entire series. And like Bojack, he deserves to be held accountable for his more vindictive acts and his deflection of responsibility, but not to be blamed for Bojack's cancellation. He is not necessarily selfish. He's in the throes of addiction. He needs to go through the same process Bojack went through, and for that, he needs support and understanding. We may not know if he gets it, but I can still hope for him, and Dr. Champ does have many of the tools he needs to be able to pick himself back up and to make the choice to break the cycle, even with all of those addictive thoughts and blame circling around in his brain. And I just ultimately hope that he will be able to better himself. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/PosiTVty. There you get extra content in the form of unedited essays, and all of these videos before they come out on here, but also the support on YouTube means a ton. Thank you for all that wonderful, wonderful engagement, subscribing, liking, commenting. We love discussing with you in the comments. Thank you for doing that, and we will see you again for the next video, whatever that may be. Feel free to leave your suggestions in the comments. You guys give me lots of great ideas. And if you want to know where I got my information for this video, be sure to check out the sources in the description below. Anyway, I'll see you guys for the next one. Bye.